A house in Claremont, Central Florida, built in 2004, 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 2-car garage, assessed at $380,000. One Tuesday morning, the owner wakes up to a sound like a low rumble coming from beneath the floor. By noon, the southwest corner of the foundation has dropped 14 inches. By the following week, the property is condemned. The insurance company disputes coverage. The mortgage still exists. The owner still owes. The house is worth $0. This is not a rare story in Florida. It is a story that happens dozens of times per year, in dozens of counties, and it is accelerating. But here is what makes it a housing intel story rather than just a human tragedy. Sinkholes are only one of 3 structural forces eating Florida real estate from the ground up. The other 2 are just as destructive, just as invisible, and just as misunderstood by the investors still buying into this market without doing the math. Today, we go underground, all the way down. And when we come back up, you will see Florida real estate in a way you cannot unsee. Welcome to Housing Intel. This channel exists for one reason: to give investors the analysis they need before the market forces their hand. If you are not subscribed yet, do it now, before this video is over, because what comes next is the kind of information that changes how you read every Florida deal from this point forward. Let us start with the ground itself, because in Florida, the ground is the problem. Most of the state sits on top of a karst landscape, a geological formation built from limestone and dolomite, porous, sedimentary rock that dissolves when it contacts acidic water. Rainwater is slightly acidic. Groundwater is slightly acidic. And for millions of years, that mild acidity has been slowly dissolving the rock beneath Florida, carving out cavities, tunnels, and voids at depths ranging from 10 feet to several hundred feet below the surface. For most of geological history, those voids stayed stable because the water table kept them pressurized. Water filled the spaces, and the pressure of the water held the ceiling of rock in place. That equilibrium is now breaking down. When the Floridan aquifer is drawn down, pumped aggressively to supply a population of over 22 million people, the water table drops. The pressure that was holding those underground cavities in place drops with it. And when the support is gone, the ceiling collapses. That collapse is a sinkhole. Florida has documented more than 33,000 sinkholes. That number is not a historical archive. It is a living, growing database that adds new entries every single week. And the acceleration is not random. It tracks directly with aquifer depletion, with overdevelopment, with the added weight of concrete and asphalt pressing down onto a foundation that is being hollowed from beneath. In other words, the same forces driving the water crisis are simultaneously destabilizing the ground every Florida property sits on. For an investor, the sinkhole risk is not just about the dramatic collapse scenario, the house that disappears overnight. That version makes the news. The more common version is slower and, in many ways, more financially destructive. Subsidence. Gradual, invisible settling of the ground beneath a structure, causing foundation cracks, door frames that no longer close properly, tiles that separate, walls that shift. Subsidence damage is frequently misclassified by inspectors, disputed by insurers, and underpriced by appraisers who do not have subsidence expertise. A property can be actively degrading for years before anyone formally identifies the cause. And by then, the remediation cost, grouting, underpinning, complete foundation reconstruction, can exceed the value of the home itself. In Central Florida, counties like Hillsborough, Pasco, and Hernando, sinkhole insurance has become so expensive and so contested that multiple carriers have exited the market entirely. Getting coverage at all in certain zip codes now requires a geological survey as a precondition. That is not a nuisance. That is a structural barrier to financing. No financing means a cash-only buyer pool. A cash-only buyer pool means drastically reduced demand. Reduced demand means lower prices. That is the financial logic of sinkhole risk, and it is already playing out in transaction data across Central Florida. Now layer the second killer on top of that. Saltwater intrusion into the aquifer does not just affect what comes out of your tap. It affects what happens to your pipes, your foundation, and your soil. Saltwater is corrosive. When it infiltrates the water table and begins contacting the subsurface environment around a property, the chemistry of that environment changes. Copper pipes corrode faster. The rebar inside concrete foundations begins to oxidize. The concrete itself weakens as salts migrate through its porous structure in a process called chloride-induced deterioration. This is not theoretical. It is the same mechanism that destroys marine structures, that collapses bridges built near coastal saltwater, that has been documented extensively in offshore construction engineering. The difference is that in Florida, it is now happening underground, beneath millions of residential and commercial structures that were never designed to exist in a saltwater environment. The timeline on this damage is slow enough that most owners will not see it until the repair bills arrive, and fast enough that properties built in the 1980s and 90s are already showing early-stage symptoms in the most affected zones. South Florida, coastal Broward County, sections of Miami-Dade, the Cape Coral Canal system. These are the areas where structural engineers are already documenting elevated chloride concentrations in foundation samples. The value implication is direct and severe. A property with compromised structural integrity from saltwater corrosion is not just a maintenance liability. It is a property whose replacement cost calculation has fundamentally changed, whose insurance underwriting is increasingly complicated, and whose resale market is quietly shrinking as informed buyers and their inspectors begin asking harder questions. And here is the detail that ties sinkholes and saltwater together in a way most people have not connected yet. Saltwater dissolves limestone faster than freshwater does. As saltwater intrusion advances inland through the aquifer, it is not just contaminating the water supply. It is accelerating the very dissolution process that creates sinkholes. The two risks are not parallel threats. They are compounding ones. More salt water in the subsurface means faster limestone erosion, which means larger cavities forming more quickly, which means a higher probability of surface collapse. Florida is not facing two separate geological problems. It is facing one integrated system failure, and the components are feeding each other. Now, bring in the third killer. And this one is the one almost nobody is talking about, even though the evidence is everywhere once you know where to look. Florida has approximately 2.7 million septic systems. 2.7 million. In a state with a water table that in many areas sits just inches below the surface, septic systems are not just a sanitation concern. They are an infrastructure time bomb. A functioning septic system depends on the effluent, the treated wastewater, being able to drain into the soil and percolate downward, away from the surface and away from the water table. That process requires dry, absorbent soil and a water table that stays well below the drain field. In normal conditions, in a state with adequate drainage, septic systems work as designed. Florida's conditions are no longer normal. As sea levels rise and the water table rises with them, the separation distance between a septic drain field and the saturated zone below it shrinks. In some coastal and low-lying areas, that distance has already dropped to the point where septic systems are failing not because they are old or poorly maintained, but because the physics no longer support their operation. When a septic system fails in this way, effluent does not disappear. It backs up. It surfaces. It contaminates the soil around the property. It migrates into nearby water bodies. And when saltwater intrusion is simultaneously moving through the same subsurface environment, the two contamination streams mix in ways that create toxic conditions for both soil and groundwater that are extraordinarily difficult and expensive to remediate. There are already counties in Florida where health departments have issued mandatory sewer connection orders to homeowners on septic, requiring them to connect to municipal sewer systems at their own expense. The cost of that connection averages between $15,000 and $30,000 per property. It is not optional. It is a government mandate. And it does not solve the underlying problem. It just moves the sewage to a treatment plant that is itself operating under increasing stress from the same rising water table conditions. For investors holding rental properties in affected zip codes, a mandatory sewer connection order is a capital call that arrives with no warning and no negotiation. That is the financial reality of septic failure in a state that built millions of homes on the assumption that the ground would always drain. Here is where the three killers converge into something that should reshape every Florida investment thesis you currently hold. Sinkholes destabilize the land. Saltwater corrodes the structures built on that land and accelerates the dissolution of the rock below it. Septic failure contaminates the soil those structures sit on and creates regulatory liability that forces unplanned capital expenditure. None of these risks appear on a standard property inspection report. None of them are priced into the current market with any consistency. And all three of them are getting worse on a curve that does not flatten. The investors who walked away from Florida early, and there are more of them than the headlines have reported, were not pessimists. They were readers of geological and hydrological data that the retail market has not yet absorbed. Institutional capital began quietly reducing Florida residential exposure in 2023. By 2024, several large portfolio operators had materially shifted their acquisition criteria away from South and Central Florida entirely. That movement did not make the front page. It showed up in cap rate compression in competing Sun Belt markets, in elevated transaction volume in Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, in the kind of quiet repositioning that sophisticated money does before the story becomes consensus. The retail investor looking at Florida today sees what looks like a softening market with potential opportunity. What the data actually shows is a market in the early stages of a multi-year structural repricing driven by risks that are geological, hydrological, and regulatory simultaneously. That combination is not something a good tenant mix or a favorable interest rate environment can offset. It is foundational, literally. Before we close, I want to hear from you. You now know about the three silent killers. Which one do you think is the most underpriced risk in the current Florida market? The sinkholes, the saltwater corrosion, or the septic failure cascade? Leave your answer in the comments below, and tell us which Florida story you want Housing Intel to investigate next. Every comment shapes the next analysis. If there is one thing this channel stands for, it is the refusal to look away from uncomfortable data. Florida real estate is not just facing a correction, it is facing a reckoning with the physical reality of what the state actually is. A low-lying limestone peninsula surrounded by rising ocean, with a hollowing foundation, corroding infrastructure, and a sewage system that is slowly losing the battle against physics. The investors who understand that will make decisions that hold up. The ones who do not will be left holding assets in a market where the floor keeps moving lower, for reasons that will seem obvious in hindsight and are completely visible right now to anyone paying attention. Subscribe to Housing Intel. Turn on notifications. Share this video with anyone you know who is holding Florida real estate or considering buying into this market. This analysis is free. The cost of ignoring it is not. We will see you in the next one.